Hello and welcome everybody to our last session of this calendar year of our ongoing SOAS Economics webinar series entitled Intensifying Inequalities and the Limitations of Global Capitalism. This webinar series is aimed at bringing together perspectives that extend our understanding of how inequalities take root in our societies and economies and how these relate to the crises and the intersecting crises and the interdependent crises of global capitalism. We've had contributions ranging from feminist economics, racial researchers talking about racial inequalities, as well as academics speaking on economic imperialism. And this week, I'm very excited and honored to welcome two prolific speakers that will discuss issues around well-being, planning, and development from a local perspective from communities in rural Colombia. And this is also a very exciting and special webinar today, not only because it is sort of the last one before the Christmas break, but also it is the official launch of the English version of a short documentary. So it's a bit of a different approach to engaging with everybody today. So I'm very excited for this launch of this English version of the documentary. The series is organized by the SOAS Economics Department in collaboration with our students in the Open Economics Forum, the SOAS Feminist Economics Network, and the Black Economists Network. For everybody to just be aware, this webinar is being recorded and is also being live streamed on the SOAS Economics Facebook page. So please also share the Facebook page with those relatives, friends, and colleagues who might not have a Zoom account. To introduce the two speakers of today, on one hand, we have Julián Idrobo. Dr. Julián Idrobo has a PhD in natural resources and environmental management from the University of Manitoba in Canada. And his research mainly focuses on the adaptation of indigenous and traditional peoples to environmental change. His work has taken him from the Colombian Andes to the Pacific, to the Atlantic forest coast of Brazil, to all the way to the Canadian Arctic. As a research associate at the Biodiversity Research Center of the University of British Columbia, he works with the James Bay Cree in northern Quebec on the effects of hydroelectric developments and climate change and their impact on cultural continuity and traditional livelihoods. Prior to this, between 2016 and 2019, Julián was an assistant professor at the Center for Interdisciplinary Development Studies at Los Andes University in Bogota, Colombia, where he conducted mainly research on well-being and biocultural resources of Afro-Colombian people living on the Pacific coast. And together with Diana Gómez, he was leading the research project on well-being, planning, and development in the Colombian Pacific. And the intervention of Julián today, as well as the short documentary he presents, is a product of this research project. Our discussant for today is Maria Fasolince. Maria is a Colombian Curaçaoan anthropologist, multimedia communicator, and ecofeminist activist based in Barcelona in Spain. She holds an MSc in anthropology and international development from the LSE and currently leads the Power Shifts project at Oxfam, Great Britain. Her interests lie in the political ecology of socio-environmental conflicts and rethinking dominant narratives around development and how we communicate them, especially with her interests in visual narratives and ethnographic photography, and through the analytical prism of ecofeminism and social anthropology. She's previously carried out research with the environmental justice team and the AG Atlas at the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, as well as the CEDLA, the Center for Latin American Research and Documentation at the University of Amsterdam. And she's also worked with communities displaced from extractive projects in Colombia and is an active member of the Latin American feminist diaspora in Spain. So just to give a brief context of how this webinar series today will pan out, Julián will introduce the topic and the documentary for about 10 minutes. before we watch this documentary film together, which is about 30 minutes. And then following this, Maria will discuss some of the aspects of the film and contextualizes them in a broader understanding of decoloniality, development, and well-being. And after this, we have about 30 minutes for questions and answers from you. So please type your questions and comments into the chat box on the bottom right of the Zoom application. And so I'll collect them and present them to the two speakers afterwards. So yeah, these are the technicalities. Again, welcome everybody to our session. And without further ado, let me give the word to Julián.
Okay, well, thank you, Tobias. That's a great introduction. And thank you for organizing this event and inviting us. What I'm going to do now is we'll use a PowerPoint presentation to give you a broad idea. Hang on a second. A broad idea about the context of this documentary, and its title is "Territories That Won't Be Left Behind: Wellbeing and Planning, Nuquí." It comes from a collaborative research project that we undertook in the municipality of Nuquí. The title of the project is Territorial Planning and Wellbeing in the Colombian Northern Pacific. Was done in collaboration with my colleague Diana Gómez, Tobias France, our host when he was a doctoral fellow at Los Andes, and 3 master students. I'm going to give you a context. The Colombian Pacific and coastal Chocó is inhabited historically by Afro-Colombian and indigenous peoples in collective territories. They gain traditional, they gained land title with the Colombian Constitution in 1991, and they are located in a biodiversity hotspot, meaning that this is an area that is very rich in biodiversity, but also be really endangered by economic development. And this area has a long history of armed conflict and drug trafficking and basically state neglect. When we started the project, the community asked us to address the issue that there is an impending threat of building a deep water port in the Gulf of Tribuga, and then they said we want to become Buenaventura. And when you think about what are the perils of maritime infrastructure, this is taken from the Government of Canada website. When you want to travel to Colombia, you find that Buenaventura is one of the places that you shouldn't go, because you can get kidnapped and you can face illegal armed groups and criminal organizations. And yeah, you go to Buenaventura and it's the most important port in Colombia, but the municipality that lives beside it faces 40% unemployment, live in poverty, and quite a few of them live in urban misery. Buenaventura is well known for being one of the most violent cities in Colombia. I don't have to read the headlines from the newspaper referring to all of the horrible things that happened there. And they want to build a port in Nuquí. So there is a concern. The community doesn't want that port. And even though it started with bringing much needed economic development to the community, the trade-offs are really, really hard to pay. There is a historic legacy of neglect and isolation in this part of the world. There is a lot of unsatisfied needs. A lot of people live in poverty. And there's a huge percentage of illiteracy. The numbers that are in the brackets are the national averages. So you can see how much, even though Colombia is a country with a lot of disparity, and this shows it. So why do we want to work or wanted to take a look from well-being to these communities? Because they are organized, and thanks to land titles and to a lot of processes that are going on there, they don't want to be left behind. They have needs that need to be fulfilled, but they also have a territorial project by which they want to accomplish that. And an example of that is that a lot of the community councils, the traditional authorities in this region, have organized themselves in a very, very detailed marine spatial planning process to develop community-based marine protected areas to conserve the resources And they are in a process of rebuilding who they are in terms of their relations with the territory, and who they and how that expresses in their culture and traditional activities. I really like the photo in the middle. It's from the a logo from the municipality of Nuquí, that is called and says that the motto was with the jungle in your head and the sea in your heart. And it's an Afro woman with celebrating her hair as source of their pride and how they are embedded in the territory. This is very important when you think that Colombia is a country that is highly racist, and being black there has been associated with really bad narratives. They are rebuilding and reconstructing that narrative. And all of this is anchored in an ontological design that is emerging from the global south, that is changing the narrative and the ways that by which the indigenous peoples are going through a process of decolonization, in which their worldviews are used as a tool to maintain control of the territories, their knowledge systems and ways of life, creating conditions, accepting that they live in a globalized environment, but they're creating conditions for them to engage into that in their own terms, doing that by a different notion, a notion of economy that goes beyond the capitalist notions. And there is a lot of dialogue with that academia has been built on this around social well-being and the values of small-scale fisheries. Something that we found that is very touching is that the community council is doing this as employing the principle of tranquility as an alternative to development. And it's the transformation of the assimilation, the understanding of a lot of principles that govern everyday life in terms of care, conservation, production around their economy, are translated and are used as a step for negotiating with the national government in terms of the national development plan, marine spatial planning, and rural development. Tranquilidad is something that is key for them, and it's related to how you relate with the world, you relate with others, and relate with the environment. In paper, or more in reality, how does this translate? There is a territorial planning process going on from the bottom up in Northern Chocó. The collective titling allowed by the National Constitution and the collective titling law in 1993, and community groups for artisanal fishing have organized themselves, not only in Nuquí, but in all that region, to create marine protected areas to ensure that they will have continued access to the coastal resources. This was done to exclude tuna purseaners, to regulate shrimp trawlers, and to enable local community members to fish responsibly, to strengthen their local economy. So this is done by developing clear geographic limits and specific management objectives, biodiversity conservation and sustainable use, regulating this through a management plan, and co-managing the territory with environmental authorities. So the narrative changes in terms of that we cannot do anything for our territory, to this is our territory, we can conserve it, and we can live the way we want it from it. What does this look like in the territory? There is an initiatives of community ecotourism in Nuquí that are actually administered by a lot of women and have been a linchpin on the economy. And with the COVID pandemic, it has been a center for the community to respond to what is happening there, to the downturn in tourism and to developing diverse economies so they don't depend on a single sector. There is a huge promotion of local cuisine. This area has one of the best renowned gastronomies of the northern Pacific of Colombia. And through that, they have been able to revitalize local agriculture, develop festivals, not only for outsiders, but also for locals to celebrate all of the richness and biocultural resources. This is also linked to community-based tourism and also to food security, because they're concerned about how they're eating. They have developed alternative seafood trade networks by looking after their ecosystems, by looking after their fishing, have linked with restaurants in Bogota, Medellin, Cali, urban centers, by which there is a very interesting mobilization of knowledge in terms of what is being considered responsible fishing and how you can create a livelihood out of fishing. This again shifts the narrative of fishing being the last choice to being a profession that actually is very rewarding and can give you a very decent way of life. And now getting closer to what brings us here. When we started this project, there was the concern of the port. In the upper right, you see Puerto para qué, port for what? That's what the people in the community, the majority think. That's what the traditional authority think. And when we started the project and started negotiating the objectives of the research, they said, we don't want this, but we don't know how to mobilize this dialogue, so we are actually heard. Based on that, we organized a forum in November 2018. And with that forum, we started developing a collaborative research agenda with the community and a lot of organizations that are working there. We created something that is called the Alianza Nuquí, which is participatory action. And from that meeting in November, we created social media campaigns. We created an open audience in the Colombian Senate to discuss what are the implications of this maritime development project. And part of all of the work that we've been doing in addition to the more academic outputs, this documentary emerges as a way of communicating what the people think about their territory, how they are building well-being, and they are creating an alternatives to development in their territories in response to all of the changes that are happening. So on that note, sorry. Tobias, should I start the documentary?
Yes, that would be lovely.
And on that note,
Julián, I think you need to unmute yourself so we can hear the audio as well.
sorry. Can you hear now?
Can you turn it up a little bit?
So can you hear now?
No, I think no. Maybe you have to take your earphones out and put it on the speakers.
Okay.
Llega otra vez lunes, viernes.
Yes.
Si uno quiere salir a otro lado, todo es costoso.
¿Verdad?
Como que, bueno, ya. Y como que no vives, no disfrutas mucho la vida. Y eso es lo malo de acá, pero de cierta forma, pues Bogotá es la capital, es la que te brinda las oportunidades, entonces toca acomodarse. Llorile, llorila, bonito viento para navegar. Con este viento que está soplando, con este viento voy navegando. En primer lugar, el Chocó es un paraíso. Acá está toda la naturaleza, está virgen. La gente, una gente muy amable, gente muy sencilla, que con todos comparten. Los senderos, los ríos, las cascadas. Un sitio como este no lo hay aquí en el país. Hay muchas historias, personas que conocen, que tienen sus historias de aquí, de cómo fue fundado todos estos corregimientos y municipios de aquí del Pacífico.
En julio de 2018, un equipo del CIDER de la Universidad de los Andes visitamos la población afrocolombiana de Nuquí, en Chocó, con el fin de indagar por las nociones de bienestar y las estrategias de planeación del territorio. En articulación con el Consejo Comunitario Los Riscales, recorrimos varios de sus 9 corregimientos, en los que encontramos una economía basada en prácticas locales como la pesca artesanal, la agroecología y el turismo comunitario. Este documental es un breve retrato de la cotidianidad de esta población, que en medio de adversidades y con recursos propios, teje visiones locales de bienestar y alternativas al desarrollo que contrastan con las visiones dominantes del desarrollo y el progreso. Visiones que enseñan que es posible orientar la economía en torno a la protección de la vida, el territorio y la cultura.
Pues allá la vida es mucho más relajada. O sea, todo el tiempo que yo estuve allá hasta mis 16 años, una vida relajada. Nunca aguanté hambre, no puedo decir que aguanté hambre, porque allá yo soy de las que digo que el Nuquí, el que aguanta hambre es porque quiere. Porque ahí tiene el mar, puede ir a pescar, puede ir al monte a conseguir su banano. O sea, yo volvería las veces que fuera, mi vida ya fue, no me puedo quejar para nada.
Yo me levanto por ahí a veces me toca levantarme por ahí a las 3 de la mañana. Salgo a coger la carnada para ir a pescar. Y ahí me voy allá, aquí es donde fuimos a la huella. Ahí cogemos la carnada, prendemos yo tengo una batería, tengo mi lámpara. Y empiezo a coger la carnada, son unos boticos así chiquiticos. Para así irlos a pescar. Ahora a las 6 de la mañana, ahí amanecemos en la olla y a las 6 de la mañana arrancamos de allí y nos vamos a pescar allá a Cabo Corriente. Allá en Cabo Corriente, así lo ponemos a pescar. Si es a la albacora, digamos su botico pequeño al río, y ahí ya están ahí, pegan ahí mismo. Cogemos por ahí sus 10, 11, 12, 13. Ya eso ya viene una totalidad que le viene pesando a uno por ahí unas 200 libras. Ya llega acá, se viene por ahí a las 2 o 1 de la tarde y ahí se viene ya para casa. Llega acá y ahí mismo, aquí hay unos que los que las compran a uno, o si no se la vende uno de las personas que tienen hoteles aquí, que también las compran para darle comer a los turistas.
A la medianoche, miren lo que pasó. Él vio una casa, no sé dónde salió. A la medianoche, miren lo que pasó. Él vio una casa, no sé dónde salió. Esa casa tenía...
La pesca artesanal es una de las principales actividades económicas en Nuquí. Contribuye al sustento de un gran segmento de la población, a su soberanía alimentaria y a consolidar las relaciones con el territorio. Es una práctica ancestral que se realiza con artes selectivas que velan por la sostenibilidad del ambiente. El Distrito Regional de Manejo Integrado, DRMI, Golfo de Tribugá, Cabo Corrientes, un área protegida ambientalmente, es ejemplo de una estrategia de ordenamiento del territorio enfocada en su conservación y de una planeación diseñada a partir de lógicas comunitarias, relacionales y de bienestar colectivo. Un ejemplo de esto también son el plan de etnodesarrollo y las actividades económicas locales.
Él bogaba para allá y para acá, la Virgen del Carmen lo va a salvar. A la medianoche, miren lo que pasó. Él vio una casa, no sé dónde salió. A la medianoche, miren lo que pasó. Él vio una casa, no sé dónde salió. Esa casa tenía 3 puertas, ninguna de ellas estaban abiertas.
Nuestro plan de etnodesarrollo traza una lógica del territorio para la subsistencia, no para la explotación. Nosotros creemos que el mismo nivel de abastecimiento de los recursos naturales que hemos tenido como comunidad lo sigan teniendo las generaciones futuras. Y es por eso que definimos unos usos con relación a la pesca, con relación a la caza, con relación al aprovechamiento de los productos forestales no maderables del bosque y maderables. Entonces, asociado a la sana relación que debe existir entre ecosistemas y comunidades, está nuestro nivel de bienestar, que es tratar de estar con los niveles de subsistencia, con el aprovisionamiento y con los recursos naturales suficientes para el sustento familiar de nuestra gente. El DRMI permitió, por un lado, solucionar un conflicto entre pescadores industriales y pescadores artesanales vinculados a nuestra comunidad, y por el otro, definir unas condiciones de uso de los recursos marinos y costeros, disminuir las presiones que se le hacía a los ecosistemas marinos, de tal manera que eso permitiera la permanencia y perduración de los recursos en el tiempo. Acá en este territorio, la pesca está en uno de los renglones fundamentales, y en ese sentido, cualquier cosa que pase con la pesca trastoca la economía de las comunidades, y el DRMI sirvió como una figura que es de carácter regional para reforzar eso que las comunidades hace mucho rato venían trabajando. Y sin lugar a dudas es un logro del que ya estamos viendo frutos. Ya las especies las estamos capturando de mayor tamaño. Ya podemos capturar a línea grandes volúmenes de pescado con pesca responsable que antes no lo podíamos hacer por el mismo efecto de la pesca industrial.
El Distrito Regional de Manejo Integrado. Inicia desde Morromico hasta Cabo Corriente. ¿Sí me entendió? Pues eso es es una reserva. Lo tenemos, acá en el monte, lo mismo lo tenemos en el mar, para nosotros cuidar de sus especies, tanto como plantas, como acá los marinos costeros, que los industriales nos estaban acabando con las especies, y muchos niños, muchos hijos de nosotros, el día de mañana no iban a saber lo que era, por lo menos conocer un pargo, una merluza. Entonces, debido a eso, pues se ha creado el DRMI.
La pesca, al igual que la agricultura y la gastronomía, son pilares fundamentales de las iniciativas de turismo comunitario lideradas principalmente por mujeres. Organizaciones como la Batea en Arusí, la Red de Posadas en Termales, la Azotea en Coquí y otras posadas en los 6 corregimientos de Nuquí les han permitido a las mujeres tener autonomía económica, profundizar en sus saberes culinarios y contribuir al bienestar de sus familias y de la comunidad. En la cocina, las mujeres utilizan una variedad de productos que provienen de las fincas y azoteas, fuente de alimento y medicina para las familias.
Una azotea es una huerta pequeña que hay en las casas con el propósito de el bienestar de nosotros, para los alimentos, para la medicina. Por ejemplo, aquí está se llama el carpintero. Esta es una planta medicinal que sirve para culebra, para cuando las mujeres están teniendo su bebé y tienen dificultades, entonces también se le hace la tomita.
Una azotea es, una la parte de nuestra vida, porque en ella nosotros sembramos hierbas, plantas que nos sirven para el condimento de la alimentación, de las comidas.
Bueno, las que más utilizamos son la cebolla, el orégano, acá la albahaca negra y el cilantro, que son lo del diario. Todos los días tomamos de esa hierba para echarle a nuestras comidas. Las otras son ya como dependiendo de qué enfermedad tiene uno, entonces más o menos así mismo las utiliza. Para mí, esto significa bienestar para mi familia, para mis vecinos, porque muchas veces los vecinos o el niño está enfermo y llegan, usted tiene tal planta, y ya ahí está la medicina y se calma el dolor de estómago o algo así. Y también bienestar porque nos alimenta, bienestar en el dinero, porque cada cosa que tenemos en las azoteas significa un ahorro de dinero, porque ya eso que lo íbamos a comprar o qué sé yo, entonces ese dinero sirve para otra cosa. Entonces por eso todo definitivamente es un bienestar.
Pues la agricultura, porque es que están los productos sanos. Al menos acá no se usa químico para uno sembrar. Uno siembra su cebolla, es sana. Siembra el limón, es sano. El plátano es sano. El arroz es sano, que ya uno no lo siembra es otra cosa, pero que todo es sano. Entonces, cuando uno come su producto sano, está bien. Pasando por la chorrera, una mujer me llamó. Pasando por la chorrera, una mujer me llamó. Pero yo no sé para qué ella me llamó. Al son de María, qué sabroso está. Ay, vamos, vamos, negra, vamos a cumbanchar.
Y paso todo mi día por aquí trabajando. Y así que cuando está haciendo mucho sol, me vengo acá al rancho y escampo el sol. Y cuando vuelvo y cae, vuelvo y entro. Y así paso todo mi día. Esto aquí es unas matas de popocho. Ese es como para los animales, para uno cortar y echarles de comer. Aquí cultivo arroz. Este es el arroz que he cogido. Que está aquí. Esto se coge a base de sol. Así si el día hace bonito, uno coge 2 sacos, 2 chupas de estas. Pero nada, como de antes que uno encontraba trabajador, que uno metía 4 o 5 trabajadores y en el día hacía un trabajo. Y hoy en día la gente no quiere ir para el monte. Ya con el son que son estudiados, ya el monte pues les hiede, ¿entiendes? Y como siempre uno en el monte vive sucio. Pero en el pueblo sí, ustedes pueden poner bonito y para todo su día bonito. Pero esta de aquí, el bolsillo, no hace falta. Y si nosotros no trabajamos, ¿de dónde conseguimos la plata? Tenemos que meterlo a algún problema serio, ¿entiendes? El cultivo de arroz de antes, porque la gente todo cultivaban, pero ahorita no. Ahorita allá hay 3, no hay 4. Entonces no se prestan para eso. Fíjate que este arroz ya está a punto de perderse porque no encuentro con quién cogerlo. De antes se sembraba plátano, se sembraba maíz, arroz, todo eso. Y de eso vivía uno.
Nosotros aquí en la comunidad directamente de Coquí, hace aproximadamente 30 años estamos trabajando con el turismo. Para nosotros un logro que ya hoy tenemos la actividad turística, que es la que nos deja el mayor recurso a nosotros acá en el municipio de Nuquí, después de la pesca, ¿no? O antes de la pesca, no sé, entre la pesca. Yo me parece que el turismo puede dar más recursos que la pesca, ¿sí? Sino que el turismo es en temporada y la pesca es constantemente, pero también tiene su temporada. Entonces yo siento que el turismo es como lo más claro que tenemos nosotros acá en el municipio de Nuquí. Directamente, el turista que viene a Nuquí, si viene a conocer cultura, experiencia, lo va a conseguir. Si viene a explorar, también puede explorar porque la naturaleza está intacta, acá todavía la tenemos clara. Si nosotros como comunidad producimos la agricultura, como el tema del arroz, el plátano, la yuca, el turismo viene a comprar lo que es la agricultura, el plátano, la piña, la yuca, la papaya. Esos productos suben de valor porque hay quien los compre constantemente. Sí, entonces, si hay turismo, también hay una buena agricultura, porque uno a veces no cultiva porque no tiene quien le consuma. Pero si hay turismo, hay quien consuma el producto que uno tiene dentro de la agricultura.
Queremos un restaurante comunitario para que todo el mundo se beneficie. Digo, listo, va para esa. ¿Dónde va a ser el restaurante? Empecé yo. Dios mío, busca sitio. Le dije a Freddy Rodito, vamos acá, Freddy, mira que es que sí, aquí que en la parcela. Entonces ya llegaron a mirar que no, que eso era un hereditario, que era la herencia, que era total. Y bueno, no queremos eso. Y él dijo, ¿cómo se va a ir la cosa de aquí? Tenemos un sitio. Él me dijo, yo del sitio con Carmen Acosta. Yo del sitio. Le llamó, Laura, ya está el sitio, venga en el sitio. Y así fue que ya he ido el sitio y empezamos por un restaurante comunitario. Que queremos que algo comunitario, que la gente que genere plata, genere ingresos de trabajo para la comunidad, porque hay muchos jóvenes que se van de la comunidad a buscar trabajo en otra parte. Queremos que la gente de esta hora venga a la comunidad a trabajar, encuentre una forma fuerte de trabajo aquí en el pueblo. Somos 20 mujeres, sabemos 4 jefes de cocina. Entonces, yo con Nenny, Ana, Carmen. Gina, su grupo con 5. Y cada quien pues tiene su grupo de 5 personas. Entonces arrancamos por semana. Tenemos también para las limpiezas, que están semanalmente por grupo. Vea, el restaurante va a cumplir año en septiembre. Apenas va a cumplir un año. Y este mes de ahora de agosto ha estado berraco. Nos llega gente todos los días. Todos los días, porque empezamos muy poquitico. La gente se abrió en septiembre, pero no llegó gente. Y ahora, ya en agosto, sí. Ya la temporada de agosto, que en vez de las ballenas se ha llegado mucha gente. Y esperamos que todo este mes de agosto hasta septiembre llegue gentecita. A raíz del invernadero salió a raíz de la parcela, porque nosotros sembramos mucho en la parcela. Pero las gallinas, las arrieras, los mapalas acabaron con no sembrar, trabajamos demasiado. Entonces, en vista de eso, se dijeron, no, hagamos un invernadero. Pero nosotros imaginamos que era una cosa como esa, tan sofisticada, porque algo pues que muy sofisticado, ¿sí? Y la idea es del invernadero sacar todos los productos del invernadero a la cocina. No sabe nada de fuera, nada que sea químico, todo, que sea todo fresquito aquí, todo orgánico. Tenemos sembrado el cilantro, el poleo, la albahaca, el orégano, limonazo, o sea, que es con hierbabuena, la espinaca, todo lo que cocinamos en la azotea se saca del invernadero. Porque la idea es que con la plata que entra al restaurante se invierte en algo social para la comunidad.
La pesca, la agricultura y el turismo comunitario son procesos económicos arraigados en prácticas tradicionales que contribuyen al bienestar de la población afrodescendiente, porque garantizan su sustento diario y están acorde con sus visiones de conservación y planeación del territorio. Estas actividades son desarrolladas bajo lógicas de cooperación y reciprocidad que generan un sentimiento de paz y tranquilidad respecto a lo que se consume y cómo se vive.
Una de las partes de vivir bien es en la parte donde estoy viviendo, la tranquilidad. En el Pacífico, acá en el Chocó y Arusí directamente, que soy yo, esto muy tranquilo, casi muy sabroso.
Bueno, tener bienestar es tener, digamos, acceso a salud, a la educación, digamos, a todo lo básico, que agua, alcantarillado, que digamos a Nuquí le falta, digamos, ha tenido como poca inversión en eso. En temas de salud no estamos muy bien. Uno va al hospital y le toca a uno mismo comprar las inyecciones, todo para que lo puedan atender.
Pues vivir bien es que uno tenga sus necesidades y tenga de qué coger para uno vivir. Si uno no tiene de qué vivir, ¿de qué va a vivir?
Vivir bien es uno vivir cómodamente en su casa, con lo nuestro, o tener una comida sana y vivir tranquilo.
Para mí, bienestar puede estar como tranquilidad, la paz, ¿cierto? Para mí. En este momento estamos como bien. Pero esperemos que ojalá no se dé más adelante, que empiecen a llegar otras cosas, como la carretera, como el puerto, que va a llegar tanta gente.
Durante las elecciones presidenciales de 2018, se reavivó con fuerza la propuesta de construcción de un puerto de aguas profundas en el Golfo de Tribugá, en Nuquí. Esta mega obra, sustentada en la idea de progreso y desarrollo, afectaría las visiones de bienestar intereses y prácticas de la población afrodescendiente, indígena y mestiza que habita la zona, los distintos ecosistemas y la planeación autónoma del territorio.
En el caso pues de que yo he analizado eso del puerto, o sea, uno ponerse a decir de que sí o de que no, pues diría de que son palabras que las va a votar, porque es que en estos momentos, diría yo, y siempre lo digo, de que cuando el gobierno dice que van a hacer algo, hay un proyecto, lo hace, porque ellos son los que tienen su plata y hay unos intereses por el medio. ¿Sí me entendió? Y de verdad que a uno no le dan la parábola de que diga de que sí, de que no, ¿ya? Entonces es como votar esas frases, votar esas palabras.
Pues la verdad, yo no estoy de acuerdo con que construyan el puerto. Digamos, va a haber empleo. Pero sí los del pueblo no son los que se van a ver beneficiados.
Es un tsunami, un puerto es un tsunami, porque lo primero que viene a hacernos es dividirnos, unos a favor y otros en contra, y realmente el daño que empieza a hacer, empezando por la ecología, nos va a dañar un manglar que tenemos maravilloso, que es una laguna de cantidad de especies del mar, del río, de aves, de reptiles. Nos está dañando un trabajo que llevamos años que viene realizando toda la gente que vive en nuestras comunidades, y el Estado lo está desconociendo, que es un turismo ecológico, un sitio de paz, que está mostrando cuál es su riqueza, y la gente lo está valorando.
Las personas que vivimos acá vivimos muy tranquilamente, con una confiabilidad de dejar sus puertas abiertas, de estar tranquilo, de no estar prevenido. Y pues la verdad, para nadie es un secreto que una construcción de un puerto también, como supuestamente entre comillas trae desarrollo, también puede traer muchas consecuencias. Yo creo que la tranquilidad no se compra con ningún dinero del mundo. ¿De qué le sirve uno tener supuestamente un desarrollo, un progreso, cuando no va a vivir en paz, no va a estar tranquilo? Y quizás pase lo mismo que pasó con Buenaventura. Buenaventura tienen un puerto y es una de las poblaciones más pobres de Colombia.
Nuquí de aquí a 10 años ya de pronto desapareció, ahora con un puerto que van a hacer. ¿Usted va a creer que Nuquí ya está desplazado, salimos de aquí? Porque ya nadie queda bien aquí. Muchos dicen que quieren el puerto y la carretera porque ahí es que todo el mundo va a vivir en pura paz y en Buenaventura, porque hay gente tan mal.
El tema de megaproyectos que no iban a ser acorde a nuestro modelo de desarrollo que hemos venido gestando durante estos últimos años. Entonces hoy, mega obras como el proyecto de Tribugá o como cualquier otra mega obra que se vaya a hacer en el territorio, que no logra articular el modelo de desarrollo que nosotros hemos venido desde las comunidades gestando, es un modelo que es impuesto, y en esa medida ese modelo lo que está haciendo es pasar por encima de lo que hemos ganado en los últimos años. Entonces, en esa medida se ve afectado. Sabemos que un puerto no es una cosa menor porque tiene unas implicaciones ambientales, puede traer algunas consecuencias de tipo social. Entonces, en esa medida, un megaproyecto como el puerto influiría en las condiciones de bienestar que hoy nosotros sentimos. Ahora, el tema de inseguridad, nosotros sabemos, para nadie es un secreto que este corredor del Pacífico, en términos de el fenómeno del narcotráfico, está latente, y en la medida que se haga un puerto nosotros sentimos que ese fenómeno se puede agudizar. Casos tenemos como el de Buenaventura, que es un espejo donde nosotros como comunidad hacia el futuro nos podíamos ver en la medida que haga un puerto aquí.
Yo creo que el progreso para Nuquí es un buen centro de salud, mirar bien que sean unos acueductos con agua potable y así sucesivamente. Eso sería un desarrollo, una universidad donde los muchachos se preparen bien. Eso es un desarrollo. No sé, traerle energía permanente. Yo creo que el puerto beneficiaría a los empresarios que van a construir, pero a nosotros como tal, no mucho. Yo no le veo el desarrollo. yo lo veo como una destrucción.
Llorile, llorila, bonito viento para navegar. Con este viento que está soplando, con este viento voy navegando. Llorile, llorila, bonito viento para navegar. Con este viento que está soplando, con este viento voy navegando. Llorile, llorila, bonito viento para navegar. Con este viento que sopla aquí, con este viento voy a lucir. Llorile, llorila, bonito viento para navegar. Con este viento que sopla aquí, con este viento llego a Nuquí. Llorile, llorila, bonito viento para navegar. Con este viento que sopla aquí, con este viento voy a pasar.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Julián, and to all the other collaborators in this very beautiful and interesting documentary that showcases really well the realities on the ground, as well as the threat that is seen as such from the community of that construction of that deep water port. So thank you very much. Very insightful, very interesting. Now I'll pass the virtual mic to Maria, and to everybody listening and watching as well. Just a reminder, please type in your questions into the chat box so I can pose them to both of the speakers later on. So please, Maria.
Thank you so much, Tobias, for the introduction, and Julián for your presentation of the doc. Thank you for having me here. I was very excited to receive the call for participating on something that really excites me and enthralls me, and also troubles me as a Colombian myself in the diaspora. So first I want to just situate where I'll be speaking from. Obviously, I am speaking from a place in which I am not Afro-Colombian, from the Pacific region, and therefore I speak from a place of utmost respect. So I think here we also raise the question around how the pedagogical process of approaching these local knowledges, right? And I think this documentary is a wonderful interwoven narrative telling a story about the intricate value of social movements in people's everyday territorial or place-based struggles and knowledge, especially regarding the state and local developers. And it allows us sort of to move beyond the limits or the parameters of what we call development, which is essentially Eurocentric paradigm of modernity, as these people seek to defend their place-based cultures and territories, right? And so just to complement a bit of what Julián said at the beginning around the context of the region of Chocó, which is the department where Nuquí sits, and of the wider Pacific Colombian region, I want to talk a little bit how it sits also in historical reference. So right now, the prospect of peace and the promise of development to sustain it are of great significance in contemporary Colombia. And when we think of the global South, or in geopolitical format, we have to take this one step forward and further, because there is also Souths within the global South, and Chocó represents one of these sort of Souths within the South. It's a region that has been shaped by various historical processes, including waves of colonization, which rendered this region almost like an internal border. And also the intricate histories and social practices of local Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities. And we can't reckon with how Nuquí and Chocó are today without reckoning with racialized forms of power and inequality that are deeply entrenched in Colombia's social and political landscape. I mean, what Julián mentioned earlier, this historical state abandon has led to a series of protests and social mobilizations for over decades, asking for the same things. Right now, the capital of Chocó, Quibdó, has an aqueduct coverage of less than 40%. The department still doesn't have a hospital equipped with facilities, personnel, and enough funds to operate properly. They also don't have an actual university, right? So the historical relegation of this Chocó region and the Pacific region comes since colonial times, and there's this legacy of relations marked by structural racism, which underpins all of these proposals that you saw in the documentary. Actually, it was on this gold-rich Pacific Rim, particularly, that significant slave uprisings and escapes took place. And this dense jungle and impenetrable wildness of the landscape actually became a home and a hiding place for fugitive slaves, which were called Maroons. So these Maroon communities became the palenques, where they were forming palenques, but also quite a few free towns. So this is an important cultural memory, I think, to rescue if we want to talk about how local people relate to the environments nowadays in the present, right? I think there's this cultural memory that precedes what's happening today. And what we see today rides off of the back of centuries of identity formation and a history of both state abandon, but also popular rebellion, right? And nowadays, the backdrop is pretty grim as well. I mean, what Julián talked about, the narco trafficking routes and paramilitary presence is really heavy. The Pacific region is also home to powerful social movements and really powerful environmental activism and human rights defenders, which are under constant threat. Just 2 weeks ago, over 5 were murdered. And several outspoken community members have been murdered systematically for being against the construction of projects such as the port in the Gulf of Triuga, which you saw in the documentary, right? So I think, yeah, just situating it just now where we are today, there's 2 forces that are coexisting in constant tension, some of which you could perceive in the documentary and others which are perhaps too complex to comprehend the 30 minutes. So on the one hand, we have the indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities, which maintain a unique and particular worldview that is reflected in a local and embodied knowledge, right? But on the other hand, we have the Colombian Pacific as a site for a profound unfolding of processes of capitalist accumulation, which relegate local knowledge in the name of modernity and development, and don't necessarily respond to the actual needs and demands for decent energy, adequate health system, and access to education, right? So I think here we can sort of take this discussion into what it means to develop in this kind of region. What does development really mean in a region like Chocó? Because really a recognition for local ecologies and cultures and economies as a real alternative to the modern conception of development, or this totalizing tale of modernity and being developed, takes 4 here. And here I'd like to offer some reflections and questions around this notion of alternatives, which I hope that Julián can further flesh out, and maybe we can talk about more in the questions and the Q&A. These are questions and that I sit with as well, but I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts. So alternatives to me still sounds like we're centering or sustaining the dominance of what this is an alternative to. So in this case, neoliberal globalization and development. So what does an alternative really mean when this is the main source of life in a place, right? And I think it's important to flip the coin then on colonial framing that keeps centering development, right? So post-development or alternatives to development or underdevelopment, developing, but rather that forces us to rethink how we use these metaphors, especially if we see these initiatives and local knowledges as projects of world making, right? They're making a world. It's not just an initiative. It's an entire web of cultural meanings, of practices, of daily life, of placemaking, right? And it is from the daily actions of life that difference or alternatives are articulated as a form of resistance to imposed or dominant ways of thinking about world making marked by colonial development logics. So here I want to ask a question to Julián or to anyone who wants to answer. You know, is development based on a linear trajectory towards modernity actually an alternative in this place, and a bad one, right? Because the main form of sustenance, of livelihood, is actually not this type of colonial logic. And actually modernity, which is trying to infiltrate and penetrate, is sustaining itself on creating needs that aren't actually necessary, like the port, right? And some responses to this have been, decolonizing development, for example, the idea that we can somehow strip colonial logics from the promise and project of development, noting that decolonization is not a category in itself, but rather a process. And here, I think we're presented with a bit of an oxymoron or a contradiction, because development itself is premised on logics that colonize other ways of being, right? It's a homogenizing, totalitarian, sort of universalizing tale of what it means to be progressive or modern. So can we think about it in a different way? Perhaps a region that historically has been seen as underdeveloped is actually very developed, because to make a place like this habitable is an act of development itself, right? Maybe we can think of habitability as an act of development. And in this sort of role steaming of development logics that are underpinned by colonial logics of colonizing other ways of being, difference, perhaps instead of alternatives, become an antidote. So a politics of difference maybe is what we need to rescue here. That contradicts this like universalism around trying to make all places look the same, work under the same logics, have the same sort of technologies, have all the people working towards the same goods and consumerism. So this politics of difference is really what marks that alternative, quote unquote. And in the documentary, I loved hearing what people's responses were to this question around what is living well, or what are these notions of well-being there. And Julián also mentioned it, tranquilidad, so tranquility, serenity comes up as the main sort of force. So, and trust and community life are anchors of this sort of autonomous model of development. And it's interesting to see how these responses to well-being at an individual level end up always connecting back to the land, to the territory, to the land's health and wealth. And this reminds me of this notion of cuerpo territorio, or body territory, which is the linkage between individual well-being and territorial well-being, our body being our first territory, and the territories that we inhabit also as extensions of our body, right? So I love that notion, which actually is developed by sort of ecofeminist women, especially from Central America, to talk about these forces of domination upon our bodies and our territories. And I think flipping it here, it's this notion of well-being, which intrinsically ties us or our bodies to the land. And just to sort of wrap this up and to open up the space for Julián or anyone else to also drop in and share their thoughts. I think that here, another tension that arose for me while watching the documentary, and also just learning about the complexity of this region, is a tension that arises between accountability and cultural continuity. So how can communities demand more from the state to respond to needs that they express and have, but without centralizing a singular development model, right? So how can we think of decentralized development model that also holds central institutions accountable for oppression and neglect? And yeah, I just keep thinking back to world making and pluriverses. How can we create a pluriverse, a world of many worlds, within one state? What's those contradictions between the autonomy of building a development model, which is yours, whilst being part of a state that's responsible for your neglect and abandon, are really heavy, right? And come into sort of contestation or in clash. So I'd love to hear what you have to say to that. But yeah, I just wanted to rescue that through these laborious daily practices of being, of knowing, doing, communities here in El Chocó, there in El Chocó, I wish I was there, have been actively constructing their social natural worlds for several centuries, right? Amidst many other forces, colonialism, slavery, capitalism. So how can we, foster this creation of a novel sense of belonging linked to the sort of political construction of a collective life project, whilst also holding those accountable for neglect. Yeah, I think I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you very much, Maria, for a very interesting intervention, and I think a lot to think about. Some of the one of the questions was already sort of picking up on some of the things that you say. But before I get to the questions, and I have also some questions myself, maybe pass it on to Julián to say a few words on what Maria was bringing up in her intervention.
Well, thank you, Maria, for your analysis. It's very, very thorough, and I think we are. The word development is such a complicated and loaded term, and it has so many dimensions and so much complexity on its own. So I don't think I have a definite answer to that, but I like to use the alternatives too, because it allows you to have track into planning, into economic development projects, all of this stuff by which the communities negotiate with the state, and in a sense, it sort of creates those bridges, right? We can talk about it as perhaps as a boundary object by which people can communicate amongst themselves. I think the first time I went to Nuquí, I immediately noticed that something very, very interesting was going on, and it's the fact that they have used the fact that the collective land titling process to get traction in a lot of the initiatives. They have been touched by globalization, by the expansion of capitalism in so many ways. Even the fact that there are Maroons living there, it's just a story of those global processes and how they manifested in the body and the territory. I think I admire a lot the local leaders, Harry and Luis, because they have it clear, right? This is our notion of development, quote unquote, big quote unquote, is based on our view that the territory is for subsistence. It's for for providing for ourselves, and on top of that, we can talk about other things, right? So the local economy is based. Fishing is based on supplying for themselves. If fishing was transformed with capitalism, with the modernization of fishing in terms of the arrival of the outboard motor, for example, connection with markets, and that changed people the way they looked at agriculture, and then changed the relationship with the land. Now with global discourses such as responsible fishing that comes from FAO and is linked to a whole bunch of other strategies, they are linked in Bogota. Like, I mean, the fact that you can get fresh fish from Nuquí to a restaurant in Bogota and have it in sushi talks about that development. But they are doing that so they can replicate and can sustain the relationship with the territory, right? So those tensions are very, very complicated. How you sustain the principle of accountability. I think it starts with devolving power, giving power to the territories and the communities to decide in their own terms how they want to develop, how their ethno-development plans are sort of something that goes in that direction. And again, alternative development helps to that coupling, to that boundary in terms of how people want to live. I like the expression "won't be left behind" or "ser dejado atrás," because they also want some stuff from the urban centers. They have an education, they have certain things that you cannot deny to them. But compared with my work in the Arctic, some people say, "Oh, they're not traditional anymore because they're hunting seals with rifles." I don't know. I mean, as long as the relationship with the territory stands, there is some leeway there to interpret and to understand how people want to develop their own process, right? And part of the objective of the documentary is to show them doing stuff in their own terms and how they are visualizing this territory. Sorry for the many ways the answer goes to.
Thanks very much for this answer, and I think that clarified also some of the things. I don't know, Maria, if you want to come back right away. If I have a few questions now to line up. Maybe we take them now. And the first one is from Sara, and it sort of also picks up on what you were saying about capitalist developments creating its own needs that are not really necessary in one hand. And I'm going to take that question that Sada poses and also try to apply it into the current COVID context. So Sada asked if you could comment on some of the capitalist transformations that have already been taking place in Nuquí, and what kind of consequences this has already produced. And she says that particularly what the rice farmer was saying, that people no longer grow rice, is that a sort of a reflection? Is that a consequence of sort of capitalist development already having impacts on the community? And is that also a form of resistance that against that proposal of the port specifically, or is it more generally the case that the community organizes in these quote unquote alternatives? And maybe to bring in the COVID perspective as well, and specifically how capitalist development creates its own needs, and particularly around food system, how the agro-industrialization of food systems and food systems across the capitalist economy has created these needs to massively produce food rather than think about subsistence or small scale production of food. So maybe you could reflect on some of these issues.
Right. I mean, if you trace, let's use the example of rice and trace what has happened to rice to go to this answer. Before the mechanization of fishing and the mechanization of transportation, and also before the drug trafficking boom and the sort of the paramilitary forces and all those struggles for power in the territory, people produced a lot of rice and plantain, and they talk about this in terms of, I really like those narratives of abundance. We used to have so much rice that we could sell it, and we always ate our own rice. But with once the mechanization of fishing, people start looking more into fishing, because fishing will give you money, because we're connected to markets, and you could buy, with that money, you can buy rice from the store. But also it's very important with the vacunas, the vaccines that were created by the guerrilla and paramilitaries operating in the area. They couldn't get any product out because they would have to pay enormous amounts of money to be able to sell and reach the markets there, to sell their rice and their plantains and stuff. So that really discouraged the local production of food. With the project that they are doing, and I think that's why I find this many multi-layer approach that the community has with promoting tourism. And thanks to the signing of the peace accords and all that stuff, all of things are changing rapidly there. Tourism became an opportunity to produce rice again at home and produce plantain, vanilla. They have 3 varieties of wild vanilla in the community. So they're taking advantages of those strategic couplings with the market to be able to do what they value and what they want to do, right? COVID is interesting because it also exposed a lot of solidarity networks that they had, right? There was a downturn in the tourism, nobody was coming. And the same networks that were created around tourism, the Red de Posada, the in-network and all of that stuff, helped to bring together women to do stuff to respond to the crisis, provide food to the who didn't have, make masks and sell them to the people who go and visit them. And so there was a campaign to make masks in their sewing workshop that became the restaurant. So it's very interesting how those values of reciprocity, cooperation, tranquility are reflected and sort of transform and adapt to different settings. I don't know if that answered all the questions, Tobias.
Yes, thank you. Maria?
I just wanted to compliment Julián's very comprehensive answer and focus it on a different thing. Thank you for your question, Sara, because something that I think doesn't get explicitly mentioned in the documentary, but is something that I saw there and was talked about very openly, is this also the rural-urban displacement of a lot of the population, and also the generational question. A lot of the new generation or the younger people are also not interested in a lot of the traditional or old school practices. So I spoke to, for example, parteras, who are the midwives, and they said, yeah, the girls they don't want to learn this anymore. So a lot of people don't want to go to the farm to work on the land. And I think this is also a phenomenon that we are seeing across the country and in many other places. It's not, I think, particular to Chocó. So I think, yeah, we have to mention the displacement. Colombia being one of the top countries with the highest rates of internal displacement in the whole world. A lot of it from rural to urban areas, especially to the capital, Bogotá, also to Medellin and Cali, if you're from the Pacific coast. So yeah, I just wanted to complement that as well as one of the factors also contributing to the diminishment or the fact that we're seeing less and less people engaged with these crafts.
Yeah, but it's also interesting that in terms of that, children are. So one of the leaders there, Josefina Klinger, who's a very famous person, said that what is important is to get children dirty, right? Doesn't matter if they're fishing or doing something, is to get them into the water, get them into and feel the earth. So there's a surf school in Nuquí, and they are doing awesome stuff, teaching the children how to surf. And by teaching them how to surf, you are sort of building certain skills that they don't develop by going to fish and stuff. So it's interesting to also pay a little bit more attention to the grammar of the land and what is happening sort of in these processes, because there's a lot of artists. Like, it's amazing the amount of artists and music and stuff that is being produced that talk about that relationship with the territory. So the practice may change, but the relation is sustained. And it's something very, very important that we need to think about what is happening in these transformations with small scale communities, because at the end, I mean, I'm going back to Tim Ingold, what it's important is, I mean, knowledge is not transmitted, resides on the land. And the more you enable those situations with the land, you develop your own journey, you don't predestine people to follow certain paths.
Absolutely. I guess sorry, just to wrap that point up and we can move on to the next question. I guess my question around displacement comes from also those who are not living in the land, right? And how those relationships are also maintained in a displaced or uprooted experience. But yeah, we can move on. And I think this opens up the discussion a lot.
Yeah, and some of the questions that followed also very much relate to more generally conflict, but also conflict within the community. So Satoshi asked if there are, conflicts within the community, and whether they are also based on class relations and social strata of the community. Specifically, if there are, proprietary relationships that create these conflicts within, or that create conflicts within the community, and whether or not really the community is so conflict-free as portrayed in the film. And Sara, sort of building on these questions, also asks like how the community makes decisions, and whether or not it really can speak with one voice, and what institutions are in place to also mitigate potential conflicts between different class stratas within the community.
I mean, there's always, where there are humans, there is always going to be conflict, right? I think there are socioeconomic differences in the territory, mostly based on who has the access to the tourism networks and knowledge, who can bring the tourists, and all of that is based on formal education. Also, there are tensions in terms of who owns the means of production for fishing and what have you. There is that tension, and it's really hard to solve. Something that is devised in the communities is the local community councils. So Los Riscales is the regional council that brings together the 9 different hamlets, but each hamlet has their own local authority that makes the decisions. And sometimes they are the negotiators. Again, there is internal politics in terms of who speaks on behalf of whom, but that's part of the logic, but of the traditional logic. But in terms of how they are building networks, in terms of reciprocity and in terms of cooperation, I think a lot of those things are solved very within the community in very, very amicable terms. It is very interesting from the research. I wish we could have introduced this. That somebody says, well, I don't worry when I wake up and don't have food to eat, because I know that by noon somebody would have given me plantain and fish, and I know how to make a sancocho. right? So sort of there is that sort of a very tightly woven community network that somehow helps those who are not as well endowed.
Yeah, I think everything that Julián said about the consejos comunitarios as well that work with assemblies. But another dimension to this is also the intercultural relations with the Embera or indigenous populations, that also there's a lot of tensions, but potential cooperation as well between Afro-Colombians and indigenous populations. And one of them I remember just from an anecdote, really interesting, was in the way that they build chingos, which are the sort of long boats in which they transport themselves in the rivers. And a lot of Afro-Colombian people end up buying the wood from the Embera populations, because Afro-Colombians are typically more towards in the coastal region, and Embera populations are more sort of inland up the rivers typically. But so they buy the wood from them, then Afro-Colombian Nuquecinos make the chingos and then sell it back to the Emberas. And so there's also these complex intercultural exchanges happening, and also tensions. So not so much, I think, perhaps with the category of class, but also with ethnicity. That is important in the region. And I myself am more familiar with other regions in Colombia where this is also the case, such as La Guajira, where there's also a cohabitation between indigenous Wayuu populations and Afro Guajiros, which also are protected by different legalities. This is really important to name. There's different legal frameworks for these populations. So whilst the indigenous populations have resguardos, or a different, they have the Constitution of 91 that protects them, Afro populations have Ley 70, which is the Law 70, which has sort of protected their cultural and ethnic rights, but in a very different way. So their claims to rights and their demands for justice also go in different ways, and sometimes come into conflict. Yeah, I just wanted to compliment with that.
Thanks a lot. And there was another question around sort of guerrilla and paramilitary groups, and just picking up on that, I also wanted to interject something that especially the post-development literature has been criticized over, which is sort of its disregard for state power, right? And for the state more generally as an actor, and as an actor of capitalist development, and of, as a representative of the capitalist class, if you will. And a lot of the conflicts that have been created in the territory, that are created in the territory, are through armed actors, legal armed actors, that often represents landed capitalists, as well as the state as a capitalist actor. So here the question is, how can we also think about, within the post-development literature, not just to bring in the state as an actor, but also to overcome some of the, I think, just justified criticisms that sort of almost fetishizes, if you will, or essentializes, romanticizes a bit this local, this traditional, and to some extent also poverty in the viewpoint of more traditional development. So very loaded questions, but how could we, as researchers, overcome some of these limitations, and bringing class analysis, bringing in the state as an actor, and bringing in these rightful criticisms, I think, of this fetishization of the local, to overcome some of these issues? And how can maybe post-colonial literature help us in that? Very, very broad question, but you can answer it maybe in 2 minutes each.
I mean, Maria, if you want to go ahead, because
now it's ladies first. No, I think I'll let you go. I'll let you keep the order.
Oh my God! Oh, Tobias, you're asking really, really big questions. I think it has to be done through sort of that I'm gonna try to answer your question. I don't know if I will be able to through the lens of governance, and talk about it through the lens of sort of reflexive governance, in the sense of understanding how all of these authorities are nested at multiple levels in the state, and who gets to talk with whom, and how local authorities are able to negotiate what they want, what the pathways are, and how they want to move those local projects forward with the state, trying to do it in a sort of in a, like, going to you go Canadian here, going to a nation-to-nation approach, would be able to balance that role of state and sort of somehow rewrite it. I think that's if you get funding and find a really clever graduate student, that would be a beautiful PhD thesis.
Thank you. No, I mean, this is
for the last question to be such a loaded and and difficult question. I apologize, but something that also really works within me that I find interesting.
No, absolutely. I'm going to answer as a non-academic, if that's okay, because I don't sit in academia, and I sometimes do find that we can get into a bit of an intellectual exercise about it. So I want to, we'll bring back the last question that I talked about, which is I completely agree with not falling into the trap of romanticizing or fetishizing poverty or the local, right? And also as an essential unit, which doesn't change over time, which is ahistorical or apolitical, and that comes with its whole baggage of difficulty also in how we approach it, because it's not something that you can easily it's not a bounded piece of knowledge that you can sort of extract or learn from. So, and I think that takes me to back to that question around the tension that arises between accountability, right, and cultural continuity, which I kind of threw out there in reference to the pluriverse. Like, how do we construct, how do we uphold a place, an architecture that holds different worlds, whilst holding central institutions accountable for oppression and neglect, and also demanding that the rightful funds for the community's needs and demands, right? And I think another, so that's that question. So I'm throwing it back with another question. And the non-sort of academic response that I want to give is also more towards how do we listen, right? Or how do we learn? And I think it comes with decolonizing knowledge, or cognitive justice, or epistemic justice, if you want to call it. So how do we approach these knowledges? And I think that's also the pedagogical process that I talked about at the very, very start, as not something that is static, as something that is not romanticized, essentialized, monolithic, but is changing and contested internally, externally. And so I think that opens up the possibility for us approaching post-development. So if we want to call it that still, which I think I don't love, but if we want to call it that, it allows us to approach it from a place of listening with different eyes, ears, bodies, right? So it's also, what value do we give to different types of knowledge, oral histories, myths, different types of knowledges that live in the body, in dances, in song, in cultural traditions. It's opening up the range, essentially, of what we're picking up and allowing to listen to. So I think, I think that would be my very long-winded answer.
That was a good answer. And, even though you say you sit outside of academia, maybe what Julián's suggestion about a good PhD thesis would be maybe something that you want to have a look at without putting you on the spot in this SOAS Economics webinar series too much. But this is, I think, a very good end. Not me suggesting you do a PhD, but what you basically summarized at the very end. So thank you very much, both. Thank you, Julián. Thank you to all of the other researchers and the local community for allowing us to have an insight into their daily lives and into their visions of well-being. Also, of course, thank you, Maria, for your very insightful and important intervention on this issue. Thanks to all the organizers again. This marks our last webinar for 2020. We will start again in 2021. Watch the spaces and social media with the new program for the next academic term, but we will see you shortly again in January. Yeah, so have a good break, everybody. For those who celebrate Christmas, Merry Christmas, and have a good start into the new year. May it bring more health and community organizing and struggles and victory than the last year brought us. So yes, thank you very much to everybody and have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Have a
thank you
great
for organizing.
evening.
Enjoy.